It takes 60 years for every single drop of water in Lake Okanagan to cycle through. Eventually, it'll all end up in Portland. The bedrock for the lake is actually below sea level, which is crazy as well because we're nowhere near the sea. The lake being the most important thing for viticulture because the grapes that are closest to the lake have a much more moderated temperature. And so they don't get those heat spikes. They get frost protection.
That water bottle effect of the Niagara region. The lake protects it from frost in the winter and then gives it some cooling breezes in the summer.
Exactly. And it's the same idea here, except that it's much more compressed. It's a lot smaller, and being closer to the lake is really beneficial. It's also impossible not to look at when you're driving through. It's just a beautiful, beautiful natural feature.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 260. What are 5 things that would surprise you about the wine regions and wines of British Columbia? What are some top tips to help you get the most from your visit to BC? And which challenges does the West Coast wine industry face going forward? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Luke Whittall, author of the Sipsters Pocket Guides of the 50 Must-Try Wines in BC and Ontario. 3 of you listening to this podcast are going to win a personally signed copy of his terrific new book. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know you want to win a copy. I'll choose 3 people randomly from those who contact me over the next 2 weeks. I should add that it's worth your while to try for these regular book prizes that I announce on the podcast because there are actually still a few books from previous episodes that have not yet been given away. Don't assume that you have to be the first to email me to have a chance to win. That said, don't wait too long either. Before we dive into our conversation with Luke, I'd like to share a reader review of my new book, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, from Jocelyn Ayu in Edmonton, Alberta. Quote, love this story. The writing, wow, very moving, evoked lots of emotion. As I read the book, I thought that these are all lessons that all of us need to learn no matter what our situations are. I liked reading about how the conversations and the time spent with her friends helped her and how they all became closer and more honest with each other. It also helped me understand a little more about how wine is marketed. Natalie is a courageous woman who has gone through a lot and come out of it with grace. I hope her story will inspire people. Thank you, Jocelyn. If you've read the book or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you haven't got your copy yet and would like to support it and this podcast that I do on a volunteer basis, please order it now from any online retailer, no matter where you live. Every little bit helps spread the message in this book. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/260. Okay, on with the show. Luke Whittall has worked in cellars, vineyards, and in wine shops since 2005. He has authored or co-authored 5 books on wine. His first book, Valleys of Wine, A Taste of British Columbia's Wine History, was published in 2019. Then in 2020, he co-authored the 6th edition of the Okanagan Wine Tour guide with John Schreiner, arguably one of Canada's best wine writers. Luke's latest series of books, the Sipsters Pocket Guide, features some of the best must-try wines produced in BC and Ontario. Luke is also the host and producer of the Sipsters Wine Podcast, and he joins us now from his home in the beautiful Okanagan Falls. Welcome, Luke. It's so great to have you here with us.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you for having me. This is fantastic.
Oh, my pleasure. We're just going to pick up the conversation because, of course, last time we were talking on your podcast, you were interviewing me. So I am relishing the chance to turn the tables because you've done so many great articles and podcast episodes and writing on both BC and Ontario. Okay, so let's talk about first the inspiration for your first book, Valleys of the Wine. Where did you get the idea to write that book?
I got the idea from a slightly drunk guy at a winery that I worked at the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You get inspiration where you can, I guess, is how that's supposed to go. But basically, yeah, I talked about a wine that I thought had some history to it. And so to introduce it, I would sort of say, when they write the book about the wine industry in BC or, the history, they'll talk about the Soyez La Rose and they'll talk about these other wines, and then they'll mention this wine. And then I kept going through the tasting, and to his credit, he let me, finish what I was saying. But at the end of the conversation, once I'd finished, he kind of rears back in his chair a little bit, and he says, well, why don't you just write the book?
Yeah, I went home from that experience just full of ideas. And I went home and I wrote out a whole chapter sequence. And the idea just never left me. And then I ended up talking about it to a friend of mine and then to an editor for a newspaper that I worked for at the time, who then referred to me to a book distributor, who then referred to me to the people at Whitecap Books.
Oh, wow. Great publisher on the West Coast. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was honestly on my list of, I have tons of books from Whitecap Books on my shelf. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, this is fantastic. I couldn't even believe that was happening, but it did. And it happened within 5 years, which in the publishing world is like really fast.
Yeah,
for
that's
a book.
Warp speed there.
Yeah, no kidding. So yeah, that's basically how it started.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about your next book. Just a little bit of history gathering here before we dive into the conversation. John Schreiner, fabulous writer based in BC, picked you to help him write the 6th edition of the Okanagan Wine Tour Guide. How did that happen, or why did he pick you?
I still have no idea. I really don't.
Being modest.
Was just like, well, I've known John for about 15 years or so, just, on and off. And I interviewed him for my first podcast that I used to do years ago. And we really hit it off. And then part of the thing I realized was when we were having lunch one day at a restaurant in Penticton, and we were just talking, and I looked down and the waitress was standing over us, tapping her shoe, going, are you guys going to order or anything or what? Because we've been here for an hour. And what I realized is that John and I we just talk, and we just enjoy talking about wine. And we're just the most gossipy little, people kind of when it comes to the wine industry. And I think he really appreciated that part of it. And we just had a really good rapport together. Uh-huh. And it was unbelievable experience to work with him, just to know how he does his research and how he goes through the writing process, because I got to see that from behind the scenes. It was really cool. Oh, and he's so fantastic, and it scares the crap out of me that I would possibly be able to take over for him to do another wine tour guide after that, because I just can't imagine that amount of work. It's just amazing what he does.
It is. He's such a credit to the industry. But yes, it looks like you're the heir apparent for when that time comes. So, you worked as a tour guide in the Okanagan for a year. Tell us about how groups connected with the winery through their stories. If you have a specific example, that would be great.
Yeah, I did work as a tour guide. I worked in retail for a long time, but decided to take a year off from that because I just didn't want to explain to someone why Chardonnay wasn't going to kill them if they drank it. And so...
Well, that's news.
At the time, the ABC Club was running strong.
Right. Anything but Chardonnay. Mm.
Yeah. And so I didn't quite understand that because there's some beautiful Chardonnays here. Anyway, so I was taking a group around to a winery, and the winery, which I won't name, had kind of a nebulous story, and I could tell it wasn't really connecting. And I'd made sure, I knew the person who was managing the winery. I made sure that they got the really good experience, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I could tell it just wasn't grabbing. And then when I got back on the bus afterwards with this group, I asked them, what did you think? And they said, what does the name mean? And I was never going to tell the winery story. That wasn't my job. My job was to kind of tell them about the region and things like that. But I kind of explained what their name sort of meant. And they kind of leaned back and they said, well, does that mean it's just a bunch of rich people trying to have a winery that, that has a cute name and, some things around? And I said, well, that's an interesting observation. I wasn't going to lead them into anything. And it occurred to me then that the story of the winery and the connection to that story is really, really important for a winery, not just for their marketing. I mean, you can say one thing, but if you don't mean it and the story isn't authentic or isn't true, because there's some of those as well, that you just won't hit with people and people will see through that. Mm-hmm. And this winery did. And 2 years later, they were sold off.
Oh.
And they're still in business, but...
Get your story straight or you'll be out of business. But I get your point, Luke, because wine is a story. It's a story of place and people and time, everything that goes into making wine. And it's not just another consumer product like cornflakes or whatever. There is something there beyond just, the mass production of a certain consumable. So I wholeheartedly support your point on that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important for that. You can't learn about a wine without sort of understanding, or at least it gives you the opportunity if you want to explore it. And not everybody does, and I get that. But it gives you the opportunity to learn about a region. It gives you the opportunity to learn about a place. You can't taste wines from, Virginia without learning about the earliest people who tried to grow grapes there and that kind of thing. Like you can't go through California without learning about the Spanish missionaries. And, mm-hmm. It's just kind of part of the fun.
Absolutely. The way wine connects with so much history, culture, commerce, everything. All right, let's dive into these wine regions. So although your latest book is The Sipster's Pocket Guide to 50 Must-Try Ontario Wines, which is fabulous. There's the picture there. Okay, for those of you who are listening to the podcast, what a great cover. I love it.
Thank you.
Oh, there's the set.
Very different from the BC one.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask you about the differences, but I really like that they're good covers. Catchy. Mm-hmm. And as I say, fits perfectly in a Christmas stocking. So yes, there you go.
I don't have a stocking with me.
No, you do a demo, I'm sure, if you did. So your previous books focus on British Columbia's wine regions. So for those of us who are not as familiar with these areas as you are, you're living it, you're right there. Give us an overview of BC as pertains to wine. How many wineries are in the province?
That depends on the day, it seems like. Every time I hear a stat, it tends to change. But right now, throughout the province, there's probably about 330 to 350 or so licenses.
Wow.
It's quite a large number. Now, not a lot of them are very large.
Sure.
Some of them are quite small. And they're not all in the Okanagan. There's a growing industry on Vancouver Island and in the Fraser Valley and in Kootenays and Kamloops. There's more regions than just the Okanagan now.
And we're going to talk about those.
Most people think of that.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most people think about the Okanagan, though.
And how does that compare to Ontario number of wineries? Now, I know the production is vastly different, and there are going to be a lot of small wineries in BC. There are also a lot of small wineries in Ontario. But so we've got 300, 350 in BC. Ontario, how many roughly?
I think it's around 180, 190. It's less wineries, but they're all much bigger.
They're much bigger. Okay.
Yeah, they tend to be more acreage. The minimum acreages are bigger. There's just more land,
In Ontario. Or in BC? Ontario.
In Ontario, right. In BC, we run out of land. It just ends up, you get too high up the mountain and there's nothing left, or it's completely inhospitable to growing grapes of any kind. So we really only have the valley bottoms to be able to do that. That's why my first book was called The Valleys of Wine, because everything is in a valley somewhere.
And is that because it's a protected area climatically? They have to plant the grapes there? Is it just too cold to go on to the mountainsides, or... Yeah.
I mean, I used to be able to see Baldy from my house in Oliver when I lived there. And there was snow there until the end of June, and there was snow there again at the beginning of July. So, because it was at 5,000 feet or so. So there's a lot of that around. The difference really is that there isn't also a lot of soil. I used to work at a winery that backed up against Mount Kobo on the Golden Mile. And I had a German tour group with me, and they were asking why we didn't plant farther up the mountain. And I said, well, it's too steep, not thinking that, of course, in Germany, steep has no relevance. I mean, they're harvesting on vineyards that are 45 degrees.
Yes.
So they said, well, that's not steep. And I'm like, but there's also no soil.
So what is it? Just pure rock, is it? Just no topsoil?
Yeah, there's very little topsoil. There's very little anything, in terms of that. There are pockets and stuff, but certainly not enough to make it commercially viable for growing, grapes of any kind. Some people are trying. Row 13 has a vineyard that was up high. And of course, Culmina has a vineyard that's quite high elevation as well. They've kind of tabletopped a beautiful high level. I mean, it's really up there.
How high is it?
Beautiful. I don't know the elevation figures, but it's way above their main property.
Okay.
And it's a terrifying drive to get up to. It really is.
Really?
But it's a spectacular place. And they grow Gruner Veltliner and Riesling, I think.
Oh, right. All those cool climate grapes. Yeah. They would have to at that elevation. How many wineries would you estimate have opened in BC in the last, say, 5 years?
There's a bit of a debate going on about that. The pace has sort of slowed down a little bit, I've noticed.
Why is that?
Economic factors, I think, are a big thing. And then recently, the last 3 years have been really tough for climate reasons and fires and landslides. And it's just been a very, very slow, the growth has slowed a little bit. There's also, like I said, we're running out of land. We can't expand, very much in terms of land. So it could be that the pace has slowed. It still seems to be that there's 20 new wineries a year, but that's just anecdotal. I don't know exactly the figures for that.
Right.
But every time I drive down Naramata Bench Road, there's like, that's a new sign I haven't seen before. Who is that?
Yeah.
And so there's a few things like that happening every now and then. Yeah.
So BC can't go more north, like hear about climate change, everything's warming up. So they can't even go more northerly, like from where the existing valleys are now and plant and in, I don't know, other valleys. I'm not as familiar with the geography of BC, but that's not possible yet?
Well, it is. And I think that's sort of what's happening. There's a winery called Friend, and they're based in West Kelowna, but they've bought a huge plot of land in Vernon, which is sort of at the top of the lake. If you imagine the Lake Okanagan going, or the Okanagan Valley in BC going from Osoyoos to Vernon, with the lake actually stopping in Penticton, Vernon is at the very top. And traditionally, there hasn't really been any large amount of grapes grown there at all. So he's planted huge acreage of Cabernet Sauvignon there, which is astonishing. Yeah.
Yeah, because that needs lots of warmth to ripen Cabernet.
Oh my God. Yeah. So it's definitely going to be really curious to see what's going to happen with it. But he's very confident with the possibility of it working. And it is a beautiful south-facing slope. I mean, if there's any land up there that has the potential, that's the land to do it. So I'm very interested to see what's going to happen. Of course, we're not going to know anything about it for, a few years now, but it's really, really interesting to see that they can do that. There's land farther up from that, Armstrong and Derby and even into Salmon Arm, which there's also vineyards already there on the Shuswap. But, they can't grow the same kind of grapes. And so we either have to start getting used to different kinds of grapes and different styles of wine and having that, really become the style for BC wine. Or, we wait for climate change to kind of kick in a little bit more, basically, and see what happens. And climate change, it should be noted, isn't just that it's getting hotter. It's just that the seasons are changing. Winters are getting weird.
Yeah.
Things, stuff is happening. Water retention capability of the hills is lower. Forest fires wipe out huge swathes of trees. So the land doesn't hold the water like it used to. So then we get flooding events and there's all kinds of other things.
Yeah, it's all tied together. And you said, the landslides are probably part of that as well because there's fewer trees holding.
Exactly. Yeah. The roots that normally hold a lot of the land together aren't there anymore, or they're dead. So, there's a lot of change happening and it's going on really noticeably, which is scary and interesting at the same time.
I was going to ask you about the wildfires a little later on, but let's dive into it because you brought it up. So how are the wildfires this year compared to previous years? It seems like BC has had an issue with wildfires every year for the past, 5 years, maybe more. What's happening now?
Yeah, it's been bad. This past year was pretty bad. The fire in West Kelowna was just devastating and hot and viciously. I mean, it spread across the lake, which you have to imagine, burning embers being blown more than 2 kilometers
across a lake.
Air,
wow.
Across a lake. And I've never seen that happen before.
Wow.
I mean, I've been here since 2007.
Yeah.
And normally a lake or even a highway is usually, pretty good stopping point. But most of the time, for this one to cross a lake like that was just astonishing. Soyuz had a fire earlier in the summer, which impacted a friend of mine who actually lived quite close to there. He was evacuated. There was another fire just about 5 kilometers to the west of me here that never really was threatening. I've certainly had fires personally closer to me than that, but that was close as well. So we were getting a lot of smoke, and depending on which way the wind blows, then we'd have more smoke or less smoke. And, the smoke was the biggest impact for most of the daily lives of people that are here at that time when there's a lot of fire.
And are they anticipating smoke taint is going to affect the taste of the wine this vintage? Because it does sort of settle on the grapes and they are osmotic. So are they worried about that?
Yeah. I think there's always a bit of concern about it. I think it's not always easy to judge based on location. There's so many variables on it that it's so hard to predict it so early on. The only way to know really for sure is when the wine is in the bottle and you're tasting it.
Yeah.
And even then, apparently, there's variations. So for some people, they'll get it more than others. Some bottles are different from bottle to bottle. I mean, smoke taint is scary for wineries for a reason, because of the potential for it being, glass to glass. It's a volatile chemical that will either break down or it won't. And if it doesn't break down literally in your mouth, you won't get it. But then the person next to you that you just poured their glass, it might break down in their mouth. And then they get it. And it's just crazy, Yeah. So it's very, very, very weird. And I'm trying to think of the word for, kind of slithers or meanders through.
Idiopathic. Yeah. It's not predictable, unpredictable. But is it whether the compounds break down or not in your mouth? Do you know if they're unhealthy or it's not anything to do with health? It just taste. It just impacts taste.
Yeah. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know if
just curious
what the health benefits are.
Sure.
I think it just comes down to sort of an unpleasantness.
Yeah.
And
probably like other wine faults. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But what is scary is that like cork taint is bottle to bottle, but the whole bottle is ruined. And for the most part, it's obviously ruined, right? Unless it's in just sort of a small amount. Brett is the same thing.
Brettanomyces,
some people have a bit of a tolerance to it.
That barnyard smell,
Yeah, and in Burgundy, of course, that's perfectly normal to have a little bit of it. So
sure,
it's not really that big a deal. But for smoke taint, it's just so wildly unpredictable. And when it's bad, it's undrinkable. I've tasted smoke tainted wine that was never released. And it was like drinking out of an ashtray.
Ugh.
It was it was awful.
Right. And that's unfortunate for the wineries because it affects their brand. For those who don't know that this might be smoke taint, like any other fault, but even more wildly unpredictable in this case, somebody could just say, geez, I don't like their style of wine, where it's actually the smoke taint, and then they never go back to the wine, which is kind of unfortunate.
It is. And there's always some people who actually kind of like it, which is really interesting. They'd like that. And I should point out that having a wine taste smoky is not the same thing as smoke taint. There's lots of, we get a nice, Syrah that has a nice sort of campfire-y edge to it or a bit of a smoky flavor to it. That's from the barrels. That's not from smoke taint. When you actually taste smoke taint, it's not going to taste smoky. It's going to taste ashy.
Ashtray doesn't sound. Yeah. More acrid as well, I would imagine. Okay, so in the province, BC, roughly how many bottles does it produce a year? Again, let's just keep the comparison going with Ontario since you've got books on both, but bottles to bottles, dollar to dollar. I know it varies, but on average, how much does BC produce versus Ontario?
Oh, for production levels, that can vary so much. I don't really know the actual case figures or bottle figures for the region. I know that we have about 10 to 11,000 acres of grapevines in the Okanagan right now.
And how does that compare to Ontario?
Yeah, they had 17 to 18,000 acres.
Okay.
So Ontario industry is a lot bigger. But again, that can translate to wildly different bottling, like bottle amounts and case amounts, just based on production levels. Some vineyards will be able to produce beautiful wines. It's 5 to 6 tons an acre. Syrah and Gewürztraminer varieties like that will grow quite a bit, quite happily, and make beautiful wine from it. But sometimes, like Pinot Noir, you really only want 2 tons an acre, 3 tons maybe. And so it's kind of like, it's so variable. And I think it really depends on the year as well. So by vineyard acreage, it's about 10,000, 11,000 to about 18,000. The Ontario industry is much bigger, which is part of my desire to kind of explore it because I really wanted to know what was happening there.
Sure. And
it felt weird to be on this side of the same country and not be able to kind of get Ontario wines out here.
Oh, yeah. The cross-border shipping, I'm talking provincial borders, interprovincial borders it's easier for us to get California wines than BC wines. In terms of our selection, California is vastly wider. I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole with that, and we won't.
Yes.
But, wine is the most highest value add agricultural product that we produce in this country. Tens of thousands of jobs, all mostly rural. And still the provinces prevent easy cross-border shipping. So anyway, that's a whole other podcast. But
we could do a whole podcast on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and we should.
And I think so too. Yeah.
I've heard varying figures, but what's your notion? Does BC produce roughly 10% of Canadian wine, Ontario 85%, and then you've got a little bit Quebec, a little bit in Nova Scotia, and then you've got other fruit-based wineries in the rest of the provinces, meaning not grapes, but berries and that sort of thing. What's your understanding?
10% seems a bit low. If we're talking about sort of grape, like wine production and everything, certainly the wineries in Ontario, especially the commercial wineries like Andrew Peller, they have the production capacity that's much larger there, but that's not necessarily including the grapes and the wine that is actually grown here. So if we talk about wines that are grown here, not imported juice and the sort of IDB type wines, the international domestic blend type wines, which Ontario does much more of than British Columbia does. So the production is higher there. But if we just go with the grapes that are grown and produced here, then yes, I think BC would probably have a little bit more on par with the difference in acreage. So 10,000 acres to 17,000 acres. So I could see it being more 35-40% of total production.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's surprising.
The other industries like Nova Scotia, they don't have a huge industry there, although it is growing and it's quite exciting, which is fantastically interesting. But the volumes are very low.
Yeah,
Same with Quebec. The volumes are very, very small. So so that's kind of thing. But again, I haven't been to the Stats Canada website lately. I did that. I did used to do that for the research for my first book. I did go through all of like the annual reports for the liquor distribution branch in BC. I went through all those stats. I went through it like for every single report from 1923. Like I was that kind of research guy for that. Oh, I know. I was not fun at parties at that point, because...
What about 1944? Gotcha.
Well,
Yeah, the rains.
And then I would see these statistics, and there's some really weird things that showed up in those stats, which I thought was really interesting. Like, on the outside of World War II, they used to have a category in the BCLDB, or what was now the BCLDB, but the
BC liquor stores, yeah.
Yeah, they had a stat on what they called Oriental liquors, which was sake and all kinds of things. But as soon as World War II started, which went up to like 12% of their total revenue. So it wasn't nothing. It was a very significant amount. But as soon as World War II happened, that plummeted to like 0.2% of total revenue. So you could see, because obviously, Japan was in the war and stuff like that. And so shipping got messed up during that time and things like that. So it was a real change that you could see in the stats very quickly. And it never recovered. It never really came up.
Okay.
That. So stuff like that, which had nothing to do with anything that I was writing about, but I just found a tangent. And I thought, wow, that's kind of fun.
All right. You and your crackers in the corner there. Okay. So there are 9 wine-producing regions in BC, the largest and most famous of which is the Okanagan Valley, which itself has another 11 sub-regions.
It does.
So what percentage roughly of BC wine does the Okanagan Valley produce? Is it 90% or? Yeah,
it's pretty high. This is where most of the wine is made. If you were to have British Columbia wine or find it in a store, which you can find in the LCBO, wines from British Columbia they're going to be from the Okanagan,
right?
For the most part. The wineries in other regions are very small. The production is very low. That doesn't mean it's not good. Some of it's fantastic. But even within the Okanagan, the wineries will blend across various subregions. So they'll take fruit from the Golden Mile bench. They'll take fruit from Black Sage bench. They'll take fruit from wherever, and that goes into what, would be VQA Okanagan.
Sure.
And I think most people kind of stick with that because Okanagan right now has that sort of name recognition that Skaha Bench doesn't have yet, or Okanagan Falls doesn't have yet, or Naramata would be the exception. I think Naramata has done a pretty good job with their brand recognition. I think a lot of people have at least heard that name over the years. But most of them will use Okanagan still.
Okay. So I've heard that, BC is a cool climate like the rest of Canada's regions. Yet it also has the last, I don't know if it's the 30 miles of the Sonoran Desert. How do those things go together? Is BC warm, cool, mix, or overall, though, isn't it still classified as a cool climate despite the fact it's got desert in it?
Yeah, and it's hot desert too. I mean, we got up during the heat dome, we got up to 48 degrees here. So we can certainly get very, very warm. Yeah, that was a crazy time. That was amazing. It was bizarre.
Were there vineyards in there?
Oh, yeah.
That heat dome? Okay.
Yeah, oh yeah, the whole province was in that heat dome at that point. It was very weird. So technically, we are still cool climate, but it's not because of the average sort of temperature. If you average out the temperatures, yes, it is still technically a cool climate, because what happens is the shoulder seasons are very compressed. So our growing time when it's very warm, is actually relatively short. So we can be very cool winters, and then it will warm up. It used to be anyways. Now, this is all pre-last 5-year climate change kind of thing, but typically it will be a bit of a late start to, like, our last frost is actually quite late, and our earliest frost can be potentially quite early. So our growing season just in total is very short compared to places like California, where they don't get as cold in the winter. The growing season starts far earlier, and it's a slower start, so the temperature comes up a little bit slower. It does get as hot, but then the denouement of the growing season is it doesn't have a hard stop to it. So there's much more time to kind of do everything.
Okay.
And so I think
that makes
really
sense.
The reason is the short compression of our season.
Okay, now I understand it, because I thought, how do those things go together? Okay, yeah. Tell us a few things.
It's true. It's confusing.
That would surprise us about the Okanagan region. Things that we might not know, fun facts, things we could drop at our next dinner party.
Things that will win you a bet if you bring it up in conversation.
Oh, I like those. Yes.
Yeah, those are fun too. Things about the Okanagan. Well, if you want a little factoid about just the lake itself, maybe not just about wine, but it takes approximately 60 years for every single drop of water in Lake Okanagan to change out, to basically cycle through. So they call it a refresh rate.
And where's it cycling through to?
Well, it's just draining down. Eventually it'll all end up in Portland. But you know what I mean? Like, just as it flows out, it takes 57 to 60 years, apparently, for it to completely change every molecule of water in the entire lake.
I like that.
The lake is fascinating to people who come here, and for a reason. I mean, it's a beautiful, huge lake. It also has the bedrock for the lake is actually below sea level, which is crazy as well, because we're nowhere near the sea. There's all kinds of really fascinating things with the lake, but the lake being the most important thing for viticulture, because the grapes that are closest to the lake have a much more moderated temperature. And so they don't get those heat spikes. They get frost protection. They get all those things that come from being right close to the lake. So
it's like that water bottle effect of the Niagara region, right? Same thing.
Exactly.
The lake warms up the regions and protects it from frost in the winter, and then gives it some cooling breezes in the summer. So, yeah.
Exactly. And I remember seeing that chart, with the airflow patterns and things like that in Niagara. It's the same idea here, except that it's much more compressed. It's a lot smaller, and being closer to the lake is really beneficial. So it's also impossible not to look at when you're driving through here. It's the thing that people notice the most. It's just a beautiful, beautiful natural feature. So I think that's maybe not an obvious response to your question.
No, I like it though. Some fun factoids there.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Absolutely. They'll fit in the next dinner party. Anything else that you note about it, about the Okanagan?
Just that the regions are very different, from one place to the next. We tend to see the name Okanagan on everything, and we just assume that that's, the same grapes in Kelowna will be the same as the Soyuz, and they're not. They can be very, very different, and they need to grow very, very different things. This is something that I think is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very different. And so what would be the top red and white grapes? And you can separate them out from north to south if you want, but they just all the kind of standard cool climate grapes: Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot, Cab Franc, Gamay.
Yeah, the only real consensus grapes seem to be Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Kelowna, until recently, has really shown a lot of promise with Riesling and Pinot Noir. And so you get wineries like Spearhead or Tantalus, or even Summerhill, Cedar Creek. They have extensive Pinot Noir and Riesling plantings that are very, very good. Tantalus especially has been on the radar for Jancis Robinson for years because of the age of their vines. But you've also got Martin's Lane, which is a project from Mission Hill that started up that only does Riesling and Pinot Noir, and that's it. That's all they make. 8 versions of each, but still it's, single vineyard things. But so Riesling and Pinot Noir is there. Now, I say until the last 5 years, the last few winters have been really hard, and especially on Pinot Noir. So we'll see how that kind of changes around Kelowna. Okay. As we go south, Naramata has Merlot and Pinot Gris, just beautiful examples of each one of those. And they're right up against the lake. So they can do things like Merlot, where they can get, a good amount of heat, and they make a kind of, the Merlot from there is just got a little bit of a spicy tinge to it, which I love. I think it's just absolutely uniquely Naramata. Okanagan Falls has Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Chardonnay really starts to shine in Okanagan Falls. In Oliver, then we get down to Cab Franc and more Pinot Gris and Chardonnay as well. And I was a huge fan of Syrah from Osoyoos and Oliver, like in the really southern regions. And that has not fared well in the last few winters, apparently. Syrah in particular has been really, really hard hit. So I have a feeling...
Because it needs a lot of warmth to ripen, right? Was it getting too much frost?
It has a tendency to die when it gets too cold. So they're harvested so late for the most part, apparently. And well, I know they are. They're harvested a little bit later. And the vines just don't have time to shut down and protect themselves properly. And so that's what happened over the last few years, apparently, where just the vines weren't protected and they had to be, and then they got subjected to this really lengthy cold snap and just bud damage and trunk damage. And it just split the vines and the wood. And it just, I've heard a lot of people are replacing their Syrah with Cab Franc or other grape varieties.
Oh, that's too bad. Although Cab Franc is great too. But what would be kind of your top 2 travel tips if we want to visit the Okanagan? Now, I know there's all these subregions, but 2 things we should keep in mind when we go there.
Plan your trip. Make appointments wherever you can. The difference, and I haven't been to Ontario during the high season yet to really know how important appointments are, but in BC, they really are.
Okay. Especially
in the shoulder seasons, because some wineries just aren't big enough to be able to stay open all year round. Ontario's industry is much more 24/7, not 24/7, but, full time year round. It's not as seasonal, whereas in BC it's very seasonal. So you can't just sort of walk in to a winery at any time of the year and expect to get a tasting. So that would be one thing. The other thing is you can see the whole valley in a day. I've done it. You can stay in Kelowna and go to Osoyoos and back. You're going to be missing out on a lot of things. So if you're planning to stay, I would suggest stay in 2 places.
Okay.
Stay in Kelowna, stay around or West Kelowna for a few days, and then halfway through your stay or after a week or however long you're going to stay, go south. Stay in Osoyoos or stay in Oliver, stay somewhere else. And it's a very, very different thing when you're in the south because there's no lake. The Okanagan Lake ends in Penticton, so the South Okanagan doesn't have a lake. And the climate changes. It's noticeably warmer. I think it's more beautiful because I used to live there, but that's the tip of the Sonoran Desert that you were talking about before. And you'll really, really notice that. To be in Kelowna and never venture south of Penticton, I think is a real shame. So
sounds
like you're really missing out.
Oh, those are great tips. And if you were to highlight 3 or 4 must-try wines from the Okanagan, which ones would you be? I know that's hard, like picking children and so on, but just do it anyway.
Yeah. Boy, wines not to miss. Let me see. I would suggest, so if you're in Kelowna, the wineries not to miss, Tantalus would absolutely be one of them. Just to experience that level of Riesling. The Riesling there is fantastic. Tantalus would absolutely be on my list. Going south to Naramata, I really suggest everyone go to Naramata. Lake Breeze has probably one of the most Naramata experiences. You're outside. Most of the tastings are always outside. Even before COVID, you could do their tastings outside, which is really interesting. And you've got the lake, you've got the vineyards around you. It's a really cool little environment that they've set up there. And the wines are all fantastic. As you go farther south into Okanagan Falls, Wild Goose, I think, is really, really interesting in terms of the style. It's a very German style of winery, but what they do really, really amazingly well. And then in the south, boy, if I had to, Burrowing Owl probably would be the one. It'll give you the best sense of what it is to be in the South Okanagan amongst a huge, vineyard land. like huge plot of vineyards and with a beautiful view and screaming good wines.
And they have a great restaurant, and I think they have a place to stay there too, an inn or something. Yeah, which is nice.
Absolutely.
And one more that I should mention, I don't know if there's been any changes or updates with the wildfires, but when I went, I stayed in Osoyoos at, always have a hard time pronouncing it, Inkameep, the indigenous-owned winery. And there's also a gorgeous restaurant and hotel. And then they have a history museum. It's fabulous. Is that still all operating?
Yeah, and it's fantastic too. That's Spirit Ridge as well. Okay. That's the resort that's right there. But Inkameep is there. You pronounce it absolutely properly too.
Oh, great!
It's really good. Yeah, a lot of people just get that wrong. But they have that visitor center. It's a fantastic place to stay.
It is,
and that's the real desert experience. They have that desert cultural center there,
and the wines are fantastic.
They are. I actually went there, and I didn't know it was their first season. But I went there in 2003. It was their very first spring that they were opened.
Wow.
And they had the winery, and Spirit Ridge wasn't there. It was just a field of bunch grass and black sage and rocks. And it was really cool. I have pictures of there from that time of the winery and then nothing around it. And now it's like all kinds of, built up and everything. It's
really
and
cool. I love that it is indigenous owned and operated. And the chief winemaker, Randy... What's his last name?
Randy
Picton is indigenous himself, part of the band.
That's correct.
So it's a great story.
Randy retired recently.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Yeah, he's passed it off. And I didn't know this until just recently, actually. But because I always assume, I've been to winemakers' dinners there for years. And, I know Randy. And he's passed it off. And I can never remember. I think it's Aaron who's taken over now. But his cellar hand, who he'd trained for 8-10 years or something like that. So there's going to be some great consistency there.
Good transition, yeah.
Yeah, they've done a really good job. And that in itself, as any winery will tell you, is a difficult thing to do. So they did a really good job.
Absolutely, because you get one chance each year. It's not like beer where you're making batches all year. It's like, let's learn once a year. Whoa, did we do it right or not?
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Luke. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, there were so many fascinating nuggets about BC that Luke shared, from the profound influence of the lake to how embers from wildfires were actually able to traverse 2 kilometers across it. That's wild. Number 2, the range of wine styles and grapes is both a blessing in its diversity and experimentation and a curse in that optimization still needs to happen as BC matures as a wine region. And number 3, Luke's tips for visiting the region were helpful, particularly breaking up your journey into a few days and visiting several wineries that have restaurants. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Luke, links to his website, books, and podcast, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/260. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you've read my book or are in the process of reading it at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you missed episode 74, go back and take a listen. I talk with wine writer John Schreiner about flagship wines from British Columbia's best wineries. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
By icon, I mean not just an expensive wine, but a wine that's good enough to be collected and cellared. And that was what I was trying to do with the book, was to encourage people to identify wines that they could collect and cellar.
Yeah, it's still a fairly young industry. And yet you felt propelled to write this book, so it must sort of signal, at least to you, a coming of age, being able to name icon wines.
I would not have even thought of doing a book like this 10 years ago. It's just steady and, in some cases, exponential progress. I mean, I, as a wine writer, also came to the understanding of what we had here very slowly.
If you liked this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Luke. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a delicious, mouth-watering, savory wine from British Columbia. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.